Hello, and welcome to the fourth lesson in this series with me, Sally. In the last lesson, I finished most of the groundwork for my two data sets, the one for my accounts payable and the other for my accounts receivable. Things don't just end there. Sage Intelligence provides a range of other features to further craft your containers. I touched on some of them in the last series, and in this lesson, I'm going to make use of some of them to further enhance my data sets. The changes I want to make will be similar across both of my containers, but you'll see that the method used and some of the options provided will depend on the type of container in question. Remember that I didn't need to use different types of containers for my data sets. I could have just made use of graphical joins or even implemented both of them using SQL join type or SQL query type containers. And you should use whatever is most comfortable to you. But by using different ones, it has allowed me to introduce you to the different types, highlight their differences, and teach you about some of the other common functionality in the connector. Before making the changes to my containers, I want to share a few details on the properties of expressions. I have my connector open, and I'm going to select one of the expressions from my accounts payable container. I've already talked a bit about the expression name and expression source fields. Data field is selected as the expression type, as these fields were added from my database tables. You can see the other expression types that you can have. These are SQL expression, Excel formula, and pass-through variable. I'm going to make use of SQL expressions and pass-through variables shortly. I'm then given the options Allow Viewing, Allow Filtering, Allow Sorting, and Allow Lookups. These affect how expressions can be used for a report in the Report Manager. Allow Viewing means that the field can be added to a report, in other words, added as a column under the Columns tab. Allow Filtering means that a filter can be applied to the field through the Filters tab or Parameters tab. Allow Sorting means that the field can be sorted on using the Sort Fields tab. And Allow Lookups means that if a parameter is added to a field, a lookup can be included, allowing you to select from a defined list of values for the parameter at runtime. The last option enables the next one. Lookup Type determines the type of lookup that can be added. The default option is determined by the program and will pull values directly from the underlying table. However, you're given the ability to define your own set of values, either using a SQL query, referencing values in a text file, or directly typing in a list of values. The field below will change according to the type of lookup you want to use. Then lastly, you have the data type, which represents the type of information stored in the field. For city, the selected type is char, meaning a set number of characters. If I select extension amount, you can see the data type is numeric, as the field contains numbers. And if I select invoice date, the type is DB timestamp, as the field holds date values. Although a number of different types are supported, for data fields, the value selected is assumed from the database table, and it's unlikely that you'll ever need to change it. In the case of a field you define using a SQL expression, however, you'll need to make sure the data type matches the intended values in the field. I'm now going to select one of the fields from my accounts receivable container. You can see that it has the same properties as the fields from my payables container, except that Allow Filtering, Sorting, and Lookups isn't provided. This is because the container type is a SQL query. You will remember from the last lesson I showed that the filtering and sorting tabs were not part of my accounts receivable report in the Report Manager. I also explained the reason for this is that with the SQL query container, the intention is that you implement those types of functions in the SQL source code itself. In a report based off a SQL query type container, the Parameters tab is still included, even though the Allow Lookups option isn't provided for expressions. This is because with SQL query containers, parameters are intended to be used with pass-through variables. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use pass-through variables as I make some of the amendments to my containers, and when I do, you'll see how they work. That being said, I'm going to move on to make the first changes. In my dashboard, one of the gauges lists my top 5 payments for my receivables, and another lists my top 5 payments for my payables, by the number of days until a payment is due. In order to create them, I need to know the number of days between the current date and the due date of an invoice. Although I have the due date in my data sets, I don't have the number of days. I therefore need to add an additional field to each container that calculates this. So I'm going to select my Accounts Payable container, and on the Home tab, click Add Expressions. I'm then given the options for them again, and this time I'm going to select SQL Expression and click OK. I'm asked to give the expression a name, and I'm going to enter Number of Days Due. After clicking OK, I'm then asked to enter the SQL code for it. I'm not going to worry about entering it here, so I'm going to click OK again. After selecting the expression, you can see that the source field is empty, and I'm going to edit it. To work out the number of days between the current date and the due date, I need to subtract the current date from the due date. A good SQL function to use for this is the dateDiff function. It takes in 3 arguments. The first is the format you would like the difference to be calculated in, for example, number of days, weeks, months, etc. The second is the beginning date, and the third is the end date. I'm going to type it in. For the format, I'm going to enter D, as I want the number of days. My start date needs to be the current date, and I can use the SQL getDate function for this, which returns the current date and time. Then my end date is the invoice due date, so I'm going to enter in that field prefixed by the table name. Once finished, I can click OK to close the edit window and can then make any further changes to the expression's properties. When I created the expression, the data type defaulted to varchar, and so the only thing I'm going to do is change it to numeric, as a number of days is a numerical value. After clicking Apply to save the changes, I can test the expression to make sure my database accepts it. And I can also sample the data to get an idea of the values returned. I can now move on to the one for my Accounts Receivable container. If I go to add an expression for it, you can see that the options provided are Data Field and Pass-Through Variable. This is because, being a SQL query container, like I've said before, the intention is that any amendments are made within the query source using SQL. If a new field is defined there, then you'll be able to add it as an expression using a data field. So, I'm going to open up the query for the container itself and make some changes. I still want to be able to make use of all the fields that are already in place. After them, though, I'm going to enter a comma and define my new one. The syntax will be the same as the number of days due expression in my Accounts Payable container, except in this case, it will make use of the Invoice Due Date field from my Accounts Receivable Invoice History header table. I've gone ahead and entered it. If I executed the query at this point, it would work, but my new field won't have a name. I'm going to give it one, which I can do using the As keyword. Like before, I'm going to call it Number of Days Due. The practice of giving a field name in SQL is referred to as aliasing and can also be done with tables. It is sometimes an essential part of working with these items to make them easier to identify. Now if I close the editor, apply my changes, and add a new data field, you can see that number of days due is listed. I'm going to select it and glance over the properties to make sure there's nothing more I need to change. The initial amendments to my containers are done, and before moving on, there's one important thing to remember. I need to add the new expressions to my reports in the Report Manager. I'm going to go ahead and do this. I can now start on the next changes. In my business, because of the payment terms I extend to my customers and those offered to me by my vendors, I may have invoices that are only due in 2 or 3 months' time. In my dashboard, I'm only interested in keeping track of the most immediate payments that are owed to me or that I need to make. so returning invoices that are over a certain due date isn't necessary. To exclude these records from my reports, I'm going to add a filter to them. Once again, take note that the way I do this is different for each one because of the container type. I'm going to begin with the simplest case, which is my accounts payable report. You should be aware by now of the options to filter a report in the Report Manager. Because I want to be able to enter the date to filter by at runtime, I need to use a parameter. I'm going to add one. It's based on the invoice due date field, and I'm going to use the less than operator. I'm not going to enter a default value for it, as the date I select will always be variable. The parameter implies that my report will only include records where the invoice due date is less than the cutoff value I enter at runtime. My accounts payable report is just about done, and I could run it out to view the data, but I'm not going to worry about this just yet. I'm going to move on to my accounts receivable report. If I try to add a parameter to it, you'll see that none of my expressions are listed. Remember that the filtering option wasn't provided for them in the connector, and I said that in the case of a report based on a SQL query container, a pass-through variable needs to be used. The term pass-through variable may sound complicated, but there's nothing much to it. It is just an expression which allows you to store a parameter value that you enter at runtime. This value can then be applied to a report or container to further modify the query that is executed against your database. The lifetime of a pass-through variable is from when the parameter value is entered until when the report finishes running out. To add one, I'm going to go back to my accounts receivable container in the connector. I'm going to select it, click Add Expressions, and then choose Pass-Through Variable. I'm then asked to enter a name for it. This is the expression name. I'm going to call it Invoice Var. After clicking OK, I then need to enter a code for it. This defines the variable in the SQL syntax to which a parameter value is applied. It needs to begin and end with an @ sign. To keep things simple, I'm going to enter @invoiceVar@ and click OK. You can see it added as an expression with a different icon to identify it as a pass-through variable. I need to make some changes to its properties to align to the type of data I'm going to use it with. The first is to set the data type to dbDate, as I want to use it to record the cutoff date for my receivables. I'm also going to check Allow Lookups. When Allow Lookups is paired with a date-type data type, it allows you to use the date picker when selecting the value for the parameter in the Report Manager, and is always a handy thing when working with date-based parameters. I don't have to define the lookup any further because all I'll be doing is selecting the date value from the picker. After applying the changes, I can go back to the Report Manager. If I add a parameter now, you can see that my pass-through expression is there. I'm going to select it and click OK. I'm then asked to enter a default value for the parameter, and similar to my accounts payable report, I'm going to leave this blank and click OK again. My parameter has been set up, and you may think that I could run the report now. The problem is that the pass-through variable hasn't actually been applied anywhere in the source of the container. This is the next thing I'm going to do. It may seem like I'm jumping a lot between the connector and Report Manager. This is just for demonstration purposes to make the understanding of pass-through variables clear. Once you're familiar working with them, you can follow the process of defining your expression in the container, applying the variable in the source of your container, and then adding your parameter in the Report Manager after you've created your report. I've gone back to the connector, and I'm going to open the SQL query for my container. Like with my accounts payable report, I want to apply the pass-through variable such that only records with an invoice due date earlier than the parameter value are returned. A filter in SQL is implemented after the join section of a query using the where keyword. So I'm going to enter where AR_invoice history header dot invoice due date less than @invoice var @. Now, Each time the report is run and a date selected for the parameter, it will be substituted for the variable in the query and the database records filtered accordingly. I'm going to apply the changes. Everything I need to do for my pass-through variable is now complete. I could check the container and sample the data to make sure the query works, but since I'm sure that it does, and since the changes I want to make to my containers are done for now, I'm rather going to go through to the report manager and run out both reports. This will show the parameters in action, confirm that the reports work, and I'll be able to see my custom calculations in the resulting data. The obvious thing here is that both my reports will run out into separate Excel workbooks. Ideally, what I would like is to have both sets of data placed in the same workbook so that I can work with it together, creating a single view from it. I'll show you how to do this in the next lesson using union reports. Once I've created my union report, I'll also make a few more changes to make things even more slick. But you'll need to wait until next time. To give a recap, in this lesson, I started out discussing the properties of expressions and then used some new features in the connector, as well as some of the report manager features you should already be familiar with, to further modify my accounts payable and accounts receivable containers. This included adding custom calculations to my containers to work out the number of days until a payment is due, and adding filters to each report through the use of parameters to filter out invoices that I don't need to focus on just yet. And we saw the differences that take place depending on the type of container involved. I look forward to seeing you in the next and final lesson, where I'll kick things off by combining my two data sets through the use of a union report. Then, after a few more tweaks, I'll be in a position to finish crafting my dashboard. Until then, take care.